It didn't start with a government decree. It wasn't sparked by a flashy campaign or fueled by political propaganda. It began with a choice, thousands and millions of quiet, defiant Canadian choices made at grocery store checkouts, online shopping carts, and dealership floors. In the wake of President Trump's aggressive tariff regime aimed at Canadian steel, aluminum, lumber, and dairy, Canada didn't retaliate with tanks or sanctions. No, instead, it launched a far more devastating weapon: the Canadian consumer. One by one, Canadians turned away from U.S. brands, not because they were forced to, but because they were fed up. Fed up with being treated like second-class partners in a trade relationship they once viewed as sacred. Fed up with economic bullying wrapped in red, white, and blue. Fed up with a U.S. president who thought they'd just take the abuse quietly. Well, they didn't.
If you're done watching corrupt elites rig the system and leave you behind, subscribe now. If you want real talk, raw truth, and zero spin, this is your channel. If you're ready to fight back, hit that subscribe button and stand with us.
Made in Canada, the new national anthem. At the heart of the revolt lies a stunning statistic. 98% of Canadian consumers now actively seek Canadian-made products. Let that sink in. This isn't a marketing campaign. It's a national awakening, a shift in mindset, a wholesale reorientation of consumer identity. Buy local is no longer a trend. It's an act of loyalty, of resistance, and of economic patriotism. The maple leaf isn't just flying on flagpoles. It's stamped on products, shopping bag, and storefronts across the country, a proud symbol of self-sufficiency in a post-American retail landscape. The result? A red tsunami washing U.S. brands off Canadian shelves. American alcohol goes dry. Among the earliest casualties was the U.S. alcohol industry. Within 2 months of the boycott taking root, imports of American beer and spirits into Canada plunged by 66%, gone with the familiar six-packs of Budweiser and Coors from liquor store fridges. Whiskey brands that once dominated sales saw their shelf space replaced with bottles proudly distilled in Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec. And it wasn't just a drop in sales, it was a cultural rejection. Canadian consumers weren't just buying local. They were shunning U.S. labels, often posting about it online, turning the boycott into a form of civic pride. Bars and restaurants followed suit, replacing American kegs with local craft options and touting menus free of U.S. imports. The message was clear: you tax our dairy, we'll bankrupt your breweries. Harley-Davidson wrecked on the border. Then came the sound of engines stalling. Harley-Davidson, a company so iconically American it might as well run on red state resentment, saw a 46% drop in Canadian sales. The brand, once revered by cross-border bikers and baby boomers alike, became a symbol of economic arrogance, and consumers turned away. The company was forced to slash production, cut jobs, and rethink its Canadian strategy entirely. Dealerships across the country held fire sales. Even die-hard Harley enthusiasts, long loyal to brand, began migrating to European and Japanese alternatives. In some provinces, Harley's presence nearly vanished altogether. And just like that, one of America's proudest exports hit a Canadian wall. Amazon's cold wake-up call. No one expected Amazon, the titan of online commerce, to feel the heat so quickly. But it did, and it burned. Cross-border orders from Canada dropped by a staggering 39.1%, leading to the loss of over 110,000 Canadian Prime memberships. Warehouse partners laid off workers. Customer service centers scaled back operations. And Amazon, for all its size and dominance, was powerless. Why? Because Canadians didn't just stop clicking buy. They started seeking out homegrown alternatives, independent Canadian e-commerce sites, co-ops, regional marketplaces, and yes, even brick-and-mortar stores. Amazon Canada scrambled to localize its inventory, working double time to de-Americanize its supply chain and rebuild trust. But the damage was done. The consumer revolt had claimed another Goliath: Walmart Canada's reinvention or extinction. Walmart Canada, sensing the shift in consumer sentiment, went into survival mode. They launched an internal de-Americanization strategy, prioritizing Canadian-sourced goods, expanding contracts with domestic producers, and slashing shelf space for U.S. imports. Some stores even rebranded entire aisles to highlight 100% Canadian sections. And yet, for many Canadians, it wasn't enough. The Walmart logo still screamed America, and its historical ties to U.S. labor practices and supply chains made it suspect. Sales fell, local competitors surged, and Walmart Canada realized what it should have known all along. The consumer revolt wasn't about price. It was about principle. The automotive apocalypse. Perhaps nowhere was a fallout more immediate and severe than in the automotive industry. Ford and GM, two cornerstones of American industrial pride, saw a combined 43% decline in Canadian sales. Dealerships were left with unsold inventory, floor plans underwater, and a customer base that had turned decisively toward Toyota, Honda, Volkswagen, and Canadian-made EV startups. This wasn't just market competition. It was a deliberate consumer rejection of American brands, and the economic reverberations were massive. Plants in Michigan and Ohio slashed shifts. Export divisions froze hiring. Auto parts suppliers across the Midwest reported revenue losses in the hundreds of millions. For every car that didn't sell in Toronto or Vancouver, an entire chain of jobs and paychecks evaporated across the U.S. Canadian small business, the boycott's biggest winner. While U.S. giants collapsed under the weight of rejection, Canadian small businesses soared. Local manufacturers reported record demand. Farm-to-table networks expanded. Canadian fashion designers, once niche players, found themselves in the national spotlight. In a reversal of globalist logic, the more Canada turned inward, the more its economy thrived, at least in the short term. Small businesses that had long struggled to compete with American price points now found customers willing to pay more for national loyalty. And the boost wasn't just emotional. It translated into real growth, jobs, and investment. For the first time in decades, buying Canadian didn't feel like a compromise. It felt like a revolution. The psychological shift from resentment to resolve. This wasn't just a shopping shift. It was a cultural awakening. Across Canada, a new kind of nationalism emerged, quiet, focused, and economically armed. It wasn't about chest beating or flag waving. It was about economic integrity, community pride, and sovereign consumer power. And it cut deep. Canadian citizens didn't forget the condescension. They didn't forget being labeled a security threat by the U.S. president for exporting dairy and steel. They didn't forget the tariffs, the trade tantrums, the dismissive arrogance from Washington. And now, they don't forget to check the label. Every time a shopper picks up a product, they remember. And every time that product says, "Made in the USA," they put back down. A warning to the world and the White House. What happened in Canada won't stay in Canada. The quiet consumer revolt has become a case study for economic resistance in the 21st century. Other countries are watching. Other populations are learning. And for the United States, this is a 5-alarm fire. Because if trust is eroded in one of its closest, most peaceful trading partners, what does that say to the rest of the world? This isn't about tariffs anymore. What started as a handful of Canadians choosing maple syrup over American peanut butter or switching their motorcycle brands from Harley to Honda has now become a full-scale consumer rebellion with multi-billion-dollar consequences. It's not government regulation, not trade policy, not corporate fiat. It's people, regular Canadians using wallets as weapons. In an economy as interdependent as North America's, this kind of grassroots consumer revolt is more dangerous than tariffs, more enduring than lawsuits, and more unpredictable than political elections. Because once trust is broken and pride takes its place, people don't go back to what they were doing before. This isn't a moment. This is a movement. The cultural detachment, severing the red, white, and blue cord. There was a time when Canada's identity was closely interwoven with the United States. Shared language, pop culture, holidays, media platforms, and consumer goods blurred the border until many Canadians joked that they were the 51st state. Not anymore, since the Trump-era tariffs, and especially in 2025's renewed trade hostilities. That closeness has started to feel claustrophobic, patronizing, dangerous, and the boycott has become more than just a rejection of goods. It's a cultural realignment. Streaming platforms like Crave, CBC Gem, and homegrown Canadian artists have seen a surge in subscribers and audiences. Fashion labels once overshadowed by Levi's and Nike now hold center stage. Even Canadian-made films, craft games, and web platforms are gaining popularity as symbols of independence. Young Canadians, especially Gen Z and millennials, aren't just avoiding U.S. products. They're redefining Canadian cool. From tech to textiles, from grocery stores to social feeds, the message is clear: we can do this without you. Economic shockwaves in American boardrooms. While Canadian media barely needed to push this movement, the shockwaves it's caused are shaking American boardrooms to the core. At quarterly earnings calls, executives at major U.S. firms can no longer treat Canada as a friendly and reliable extension of the domestic market. Now, it's a hostile terrain where brand loyalty has collapsed and every imported SKU comes under scrutiny. Beverage conglomerates that counted on Canada for up to 15% of their international sales are reporting losses they can't explain on paper. But Canadians know why. Apparel giants like Gap, Levi's, and Under Armour are closing stores or downsizing shelf space. Big tech companies are seeing app downloads, subscriptions, and hardware sales plunge as Canadians favor EU-based or homegrown alternatives. American business leaders are beginning to whisper what they once thought impossible. Did we lose Canada? Supply chain disruption, the slow choking effect. And here's what makes this consumer revolt different from a tariff war or a diplomatic feud. It doesn't trigger instantly, but it lasts longer and cuts deeper. It's a slow choke. Canadian importers start adjusting their sourcing. Canadian truckers start seeing fewer cross-border manifests. Distributors begin prioritizing local brands to avoid public backlash. U.S. companies find Canadian vendors ghosting their orders, afraid of being shunned by patriotic customers. By the time the losses are fully realized in American accounting ledgers, the infrastructure that once supported cross-border dominance is already being dismantled. And unlike a snap cable that can be quickly reconnected, trust in a consumer revolt doesn't come back with an apology or a policy reversal. It takes years, if not decades. The emotional core, revenge by simplicity. Ask any Canadian participating in the boycott why they're doing it, and you'll hear a calm, collected answer. Because I want to support my country. Because they slap tariffs on our dairy. Because it just feels better this way. No shouting, no anger, just resolve. And that's what makes this movement so unstoppable. It's not driven by rage. It's driven by relief. Relief at not being condescended to by trade bullies. Relief at seeing Canadian shelves filled with Canadian food. Relief at spending money in a way that uplifts neighbors instead of funding industries that treat Canada like a backwater afterthought. The boycott has become an exercise in national dignity, and people aren't looking back. Carney's silent hammer, subtle leadership, monumental impact. Mark Carney, Canada's likely next prime minister and a trained economist with deep global ties, never held a press conference urging Canadians to boycott U.S. goods. He didn't have to. He understood the power of soft leadership, of guiding through tone, through silence, through support of Canadian enterprise without sloganeering. Carney's administration responded not with megaphones, but with funding for Canadian producers, tax incentives for made-in-Canada manufacturing, and quiet pressure on retailers to pivot away from vulnerable U.S. supply chains. The message from Ottawa was unmistakable. If you build Canadian, we'll back you. If you buy Canadian, we'll grow together. And Canadians listened. U.S. response: denial, confusion, collapse. Back in Washington, the response was a textbook case of strategic incompetence. Some blamed Canada for being overly emotional. Others denied the boycott was even real. A few called for retaliatory tariffs, failing to understand that Canada's revolt wasn't against U.S. policy, it was against U.S. arrogance. As American industries hemorrhaged Canadian revenue, U.S. lawmakers scrambled to distract. Some pivoted to China bashing. Others peddled protectionism or offered tax breaks to offset losses. But none addressed the core issue. Why does one of our closest allies no longer trust us with their wallets? No amount of spin can paper over the truth. The U.S. broke the friendship, and the consumer revolt is just a bill coming due. Ripple effect, who's next? Perhaps the most unnerving question for U.S. trade officials isn't how to fix the damage in Canada. It's who's watching. Australia, New Zealand, France, Germany, Japan. What happens if other middle power nations realize they, too, can reshape their economies through strategic, patriotic consumerism? What if the Buy Canadian movement inspires a global echo, a push toward local goods, cultural independence, and economic insulation from U.S. instability? What if the world decides it no longer wants to be held hostage by America's mood swings? That's not just a consumer revolt. That's a new world order in retail. The future is local, and the U.S. is outside the circle. This isn't the Cold War. Canada isn't building walls or closing borders. It's opening up, just not to the United States. Canadian businesses are expanding ties with European suppliers, Pacific Rim producers, and domestic innovators. Consumers are exploring new flavors, products, and brands that don't come with a Trump-era hangover. The U.S., once the sun around which the Canadian economy orbited, is now just another distant planet, visible but irrelevant. And if U.S. leaders don't comprehend what happened, if they keep mistaking economic bullying for negotiation, they will wake up one day to find not just Canada gone, but an entire axis of the global market realigned against them. What's most remarkable isn't just that Canada walked away from American goods. It's that it didn't look back. In doing so, Canada has begun crafting something that few thought possible just a decade ago, a self-sustaining, proudly independent economic identity. This isn't some isolationist fantasy. It's the realization that for too long, Canadian businesses were told that success meant playing by U.S. rules, selling to U.S. buyers, and importing from U.S. brands. That framework is now obsolete. Canadian firms are finding new partners, creating their own technologies, and reviving industries once dismissed as non-competitive. Textile mills in Quebec, electronics assembly in Ontario, vertical farms in Alberta. Every purchase not made in the U.S. is a vote for domestic reinvention, and it's working. Even national grocery chains have taken up the mantle. Loblaws, Metro, Save-On-Foods, they've turned store branding into a statement, flooding their aisles with 100% Canadian labels, featuring farm co-ops, regional processors, and indigenous-owned suppliers. The result? Surging sales and renewed consumer trust. What began as economic self-defense has become a blueprint for resilient national strategy, a roadmap for other countries, even smaller ones, who've long felt captive to the sheer gravitational pull of U.S. market power. Now they're asking, if Canada can do it, why can't we? Washington's miscalculation, mistaking volume for value. In the U.S., the fundamental miscalculation was always the same, thinking that because they sell the most, they are worth the most. But consumer loyalty isn't transactional. It's emotional, cultural, ethical. You can sell the cheapest jeans, the flashiest trucks, or the strongest whiskey, but if your consumers feel disrespected, manipulated, or disposable, they'll stop buying. And they won't come back just because your prices drop. The U.S. never considered that its largest trading partner could grow tired of being the junior sibling in the relationship. It never thought its most reliable neighbor would choose economic divorce over more abuse. Yet here we are, and the lesson couldn't be clearer. Trade is not about dominance. It's about trust. Break that, and all the tariffs in the world can't bring the shelves back. Final reflection, the power of a purchase. So the next time someone tells you that politics doesn't belong in the checkout aisle, think again. Because what's happening in Canada is proof that every dollar spent is a decision, a declaration, a direction. Canadians have chosen theirs. And in doing so, they've done more to reshape trade policy, manufacturing priorities, and corporate behavior than any politician or diplomat ever could. All with a credit card. All without saying a word.